smell of incense and memories. His footsteps, no matter how careful, seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Each creak of the floorboards sent his heart racing. The faces in the photographs seemed to follow his movement, their expressions shifting subtly into the dim light. Ming told himself it was just tricks of shadow and perspective. He selected 3 urns at random, trying not to look at the photographs or names. Better not to think of them as people, just objects that would be temporarily borrowed. His hands trembled as he carefully removed each urn from its resting place, replacing it with a handwritten note. Your loved one is safe. 50,000 HKD for their return. Instructions to follow. Tell no one. Ming left his encrypted messaging handle at the bottom of each note. He had spent hours practicing the characters, making sure they were clear, but impossible to trace back to his hand. The urns felt heavier than they should as he placed them in his backpack, their weight seeming to increase with each step toward the exit. The first 2 ransoms were paid within days. The families were wealthy enough not to risk their ancestors' eternal rest over what amounted to a few thousand US. Ming kept his word, returning the urns to predetermined locations, public restrooms in busy shopping centers, the backs of Buddhist temples, once even in a McDonald's playground at dawn. The money kept him fed and housed for another month. Mr. Wong stopped giving him those looks. Ming even bought new shoes, his first in 2 years. But the nights grew longer, filled with strange dreams of endless corridors and watching faces. Sometimes he woke to find his apartment thick with the smell of incense, though he burned none. The 3rd urn belonged to someone named Chen Wei-ling, deceased 1989. Try as he might, Ming couldn't avoid looking at this photograph. It showed a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a subtle smile that seemed oddly familiar, though Ming was certain they had never met. 3 days after leaving the ransom note, he received a message. I will pay. Meet me at the Pak Kung Temple tonight at midnight. Bring my urn. The temple was small and rarely visited, tucked away in an alley where the neon lights of the city couldn't reach. Ming arrived early, carrying Chen's urn in his backpack. The night air was unusually cold for September, and an odd mist had settled in the narrow street, swirling around his ankles like hungry cats. The temple's incense burner had been cold for hours, yet the smell of sandalwood and ash grew stronger with each passing minute. Ming checked his phone repeatedly, watching as 11:59 turned to midnight. The street lamps began to flicker, their light dimming until the alley was lit only by the faint glow of distant signs. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man in his 50s, wearing an outdated suit that seemed somehow familiar. His footsteps made no sound on the wet pavement, and the mist parted before him like a curtain drawn back by invisible hands. Do you have it? The man asked, his voice carrying an ethereal echo that Ming desperately tried to attribute to the temple's acoustics. Ming nodded, carefully removing the urn from his backpack. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. Count it, he said, handing it to Ming. The bills felt strange, too thin, too crisp. In the dim light, Ming had to squint to make out the denominations. His heart stopped. The money wasn't money at all. Each bill was joss paper hell money meant to be burned for the dead. And now that he looked closer, really looked, the man's suit was the same one from the photograph in the columbarium. Chen Wei-ling's kind eyes weren't kind anymore. Is something wrong? Chen asked, his face beginning to shift, skin turning gray and translucent like old paper. Isn't this what you wanted? Money? His smile widened impossibly, revealing teeth that were far too sharp, far too numerous. We can make so much more together, you and I. There are so many urns, so many families willing to pay. Ming dropped the hell money and ran, leaving the urn behind. He could hear Chen's laughter echoing through the streets, bouncing off buildings that suddenly seemed much older, much more decrepit than they had been moments before. The neon signs above had transformed into ghost fires, floating orbs of blue and green that illuminated faces in the windows' faces of people who had died decades ago, all wearing the same terrible smiles. The streets themselves seemed to shift and change, familiar routes twisting into impossible geometries. More than once, Ming found himself running past the same temple, Chen's laughter growing closer each time. The hell money fluttered in his wake, each bill burning with a cold fire that illuminated more spectral faces emerging from the walls. He didn't stop running until he reached his coffin apartment, slamming the door behind him and collapsing onto his thin mattress. The hell money had somehow made its way into his pockets, spilling onto the floor in endless streams. The faces in the bills seemed to move, mouths opening in silent screams or terrible laughter. In his panic, Ming did the only thing he could think of. He gathered the papers and set them alight, hoping to appease whatever supernatural force he had angered. The flames caught too quickly. They spread across the floor like living things, ignoring physics and reason. Ming screamed as the fire crawled up the walls, taking on shapes that looked disturbingly like human figures dancing in their burning agony. Through the smoke and heat, he saw Chen Wei-ling standing in the corner, still wearing that terrible smile, but he wasn't alone anymore. Behind him stood shadows of others, the owners of every urn in the columbarium. Thousands of spectral figures, all reaching out with burning hands. "Attorney, you wanted to profit from the dead," Chen said, his voice now a chorus of countless others. "Now you'll learn what it means to join us. We have such wonderful things to show you, little grave robber. Such wonderful, terrible things." The flames engulfed Ming before he could reach the door. His neighbors would later report hearing screams, but by the time firefighters broke down the door, they found only ashes, far more ashes than a human body should produce. The walls of the tiny apartment were scorched with strange patterns that some said resembled Chinese characters spelling out warnings about it disturbing the rest of the dead. The 3 urns Ming had stolen were found in his apartment, completely untouched by the fire. When they were returned to the columbarium, the staff noticed something odd about Chen Wei-ling's niche. The photograph had changed. The kind-faced man was still smiling, but now there was someone else in the background, barely visible, their face contorted in eternal screaming. Some say that on quiet nights, when the living are asleep and the dead are at their most active, you can still hear Ming's screams echoing through the corridors of the columbarium. The security guard, who no longer dozes off during his shift, swears he sometimes sees a figure in the shadows, desperately trying to return something to the dead, but never finding peace. In Sham Shui Po, Ming's old coffin apartment remains vacant. No amount of renovation could remove the burnt patterns from the walls, and no tenant stays longer than a single night. They all report the same thing: the overwhelming smell of incense, the sound of rustling joss paper, and the sensation of being watched by someone who learned too late that the dead don't bargain with the living. The building's owner eventually sealed off the unit entirely, but late at night, residents still see hell money floating down from somewhere above, burning without fire, carrying the whispered warnings of a man who dared to ransom the dead. Story 2. The scent of burning sage filled Master Wei's study for what he hoped would be the last time. Each tendril of smoke curled through the air with deliberate slowness, as if the incense itself was reluctant to mark this ending. After 30 years of serving as a medium between the living and the dead, he was ready to close this chapter of his life. His fingers traced the worn edges of his ancestral meditation bowl, memorizing every scratch and dent that marked decades of supernatural encounters. The bronze had been polished smooth by generations of hands before his hands that had also parted the veil between worlds. Outside, Hong Kong's autumn sky had begun its transition from afternoon to evening, that liminal time when the barrier between realms grew thinnest. The late sun cast long shadows through the paper screens of his modest apartment in Kowloon Bay, transforming familiar objects into mysterious silhouettes. The city's endless drone seemed distant, muffled by the weight of what was to come. His final clients would arrive soon, a meeting that would prove far more fateful than he could have imagined. Wei took his time arranging his tools, the jade pendulum passed down through 5 generations, the yellowed papers covered in protective sigils, the small vials of blessed water collected from 7 different temples. Each item held memories of countless encounters with the restless dead. The pendulum had guided him to hidden graves. The sigils had warded off vengeful spirits. The blessed water had given peace to souls trapped between worlds. "Are you sure about this, Father?" Wei looked up to find his teenage son, Jin Ho, standing in the doorway. At 15, he was at that peculiar threshold between childhood and adulthood, his gangly frame somehow both awkward and graceful. Concern etched across his young face, making him look momentarily older than his years. Wei had noticed lately how his son's eyes would sometimes drift to empty corners of rooms, following movements. Only he could see the first signs of inheriting Wei's gift, though Wei had done his best to shield him from that burden. "The dead have taken enough of my time," Wei replied, managing a tired smile. He carefully placed the pendulum in its silk-lined box, each movement deliberate and respectful. "Your mother deserves better than a husband who spends more time with ghosts than a living." He didn't mention the toll it had taken, the sleepless nights, the cold sweats, the way the spirits had begun to follow him even to his dreams. How sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, he would wake to find his room filled with shadowy figures, all waiting their turn to tell their stories. The brass bell by his door chimed softly in the stillness, though no wind stirred the air. Jinho's eyes widened slightly, too. Before either could speak, a gentle knock interrupted their shared moment of understanding. Wei's neighbor and fellow spiritual practitioner, Mei Lin, poked her head in. Her silver hair was tied back in a neat bun, and the countless crystal pendants around her neck caught the fading sunlight, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the walls. "They're here," she said softly, each crystal swaying with its own subtle rhythm. "And Wei—" She paused, her weathered hand clutching one particular stone, a piece of raw amethyst she only touched when sensing powerful spiritual disturbances. "There's something different about this one. I can feel it." Wei nodded, recognizing the slight tremor in her voice. After so many years, he had learned to trust Mei Lin's intuition. The crystals she wore weren't mere decorations. They were spiritual sensors attuned to the presence of restless souls. Each one had been carefully selected and consecrated for its purpose. Some warned of malevolent spirits, others attracted benevolent ones, and a few, like the amethyst she now gripped, served as early warning systems for particularly powerful supernatural entities. The clients, Mr. and Mrs. Wang, entered like shadows cast by the dying sun. Even before they crossed his threshold, Wei felt the disturbance they brought with them, a subtle shift in the air pressure, a barely perceptible drop in temperature that made the incense smoke coil defensively around his protective talismans. Mr. Wang was tall and athletic, carrying himself with the confidence of someone used to being in control. Though Wei noticed how his right hand continuously clenched and unclenched, betraying an inner tension. His expensive watch caught the light as he moved, its face mysteriously fogged despite the room's warmth. Mrs. Wang was visibly pregnant, perhaps 7 months along, her floral maternity dress doing little to hide her condition. But what struck Wei was the hollow fear in her eyes, the kind of bone-deep terror that came from too many nights spent staring into darkness, watching something that shouldn't exist. Dark circles beneath them suggested many sleepless nights, and her fingernails were bitten to the quick. She moved as if carrying not just her unborn child, but an invisible weight that bent her shoulders forward. "Please." Wei gestured to the cushions before his low table, watching how the couple unconsciously maintained a small distance between themselves as they sat. The space between them seemed charged with unspoken words. "Tell me what brings you here." Maylin settled herself in the corner, her crystals creating a protective circle around the space. Each stone had been chosen for this final consultation. Black tourmaline for protection, selenite for clarity, and rose quartz to calm troubled spirits. The amethyst at her throat continued its subtle pulsing like a second heartbeat. Mrs. Wang's hands trembled as she settled herself, her fingers instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly. "It started 3 weeks ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to catch in her throat as if something cold and wet was trying to stop them from emerging. At first, it was just the cold spots in our apartment, places where the air would suddenly feel like winter, even with all the windows closed and the air conditioning off. She paused, glancing at her husband as if seeking permission to continue. His face remained carefully neutral, but Wei noticed a muscle twitching in his jaw. The incense smoke began to gather unusually thick around him, as if drawn to something only it could sense. Then the water, Mrs. Wang's voice cracked slightly. "The water," Wei leaned forward, sensing the weight of unspoken words. The jade pendulum in its box began to swing of its own accord, marking time like a metronome, counting down to something inevitable. "Every morning our bedroom floor is wet, soaking wet with salt water," Mr. Wang interrupted, his tone suggesting he couldn't quite believe what he was saying even now. His carefully maintained facade cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of genuine fear. "And the smell of the ocean, even though we live in the city center. At first I thought it was a leak, had plumbers check everything twice. But they found nothing. And the salt. No pipe carries seawater to our building." Mrs. Wang clutched her belly more tightly, and Wei noticed how the temperature in the room dropped several degrees at her next words. "But that's not the worst part. Sometimes at night, I see her. A young woman in a white swimming suit, her hair floating as if underwater. She stands by our bed, dripping, staring at my husband with such hatred. A single drop of water fell from nowhere, landing on the table between them with an impossibly loud splash. Everyone jumped slightly except Wei, who watched the liquid spread with practiced calmness. It left behind a faint trace of salt when it evaporated moments later. "She never looks at me," Mrs. Wang continued, her voice growing stronger as she finally gave voice to her fears. "Only at him. And sometimes I hear her crying in our bathroom. When I turn on the light, the mirror is covered in condensation, and there are words written in it. Always the same words. You promised." Wei noticed Mr. Wang's jaw tighten further, a flicker of guilt crossing his face before being quickly masked by practiced indifference. Years of experience had taught Wei that ghosts rarely haunted without reason. The living usually carried the seeds of their own haunting, fertilized by secrets and watered with denial. The paper screens rustled without wind, and in their shadows, Wei caught a glimpse of movement, a dark shape, sinuous and fluid, like seaweed drifting in deep waters. Jin Ho, still standing by the doorway, drew in a sharp breath. His son's emerging gift was obviously letting him see something beyond the ordinary play of light and shadow. Malin's crystals began to hum, a high-pitched sound that set their teeth on edge. The stones vibrated against each other, creating a discordant melody that spoke of turbulent spirits and troubled waters. "Wei," she warned, her voice tight with concentration as she tried to maintain the protective circle. "We're not alone." The confession, when it came, burst from Mr. Wong like water from a broken dam. His carefully maintained composure shattered, revealing the desperate man beneath. "Her name was Michelle Chen," he said, the words tumbling out as if he could no longer contain them. "She was my student at the swimming center, elite athlete, training for the national team. What happened between us? It was a mistake. When she told me she was pregnant." His voice cracked, and in that moment, the room's temperature plummeted. Frost began to form on the windows despite the autumn warmth outside. The incense flames flickered violently, casting wild shadows that seemed to take on human shapes. "I told her to get rid of it," he continued, unable to stop now that he had begun. "Said I would deny everything, that it would ruin both our careers. 2 days later, they found her body washed up at Repulse Bay. The police called it suicide, but..." Mrs. Wong's cry of anguish was drowned out by a sudden, violent gust of wind that extinguished every light in the room. In the darkness, Wei saw her clearly, the ghost of Michelle Chen, her white swimming suit torn and stained with seaweed, her skin bleached white by the ocean's embrace. Her hair writhed like living tentacles, and her eyes burned with an otherworldly phosphorescence that illuminated her face from within, revealing features distorted by death and rage. Water began to pool around her feet, spreading across Wei's floor in defiance of gravity, carrying with it the bitter scent of loss and betrayal. The ghost's presence brought more than just physical manifestations, carried the weight of broken promises, shattered dreams, and a mother's grief that had fermented into something dangerous in the depths of the sea. "You promised me forever," the ghost's voice gurgled, seawater spilling from her mouth with each word, the liquid black in the darkness. "You said our baby would be perfect." Her words carried the echo of waves crashing against rocks, of depths where sunlight never reached. Each syllable sent ripples through the growing pool of water on the floor, creating patterns that resembled tiny, grasping hands. Wei moved with practiced deliberation, positioning himself between the spirit and the living. The protective sigils in his pockets grew warm against his skin, responding to the supernatural presence. Behind him, he could hear Mei Lin beginning a protective chant, her voice steady despite the paranormal chaos unfolding around them. Her crystals glowed with defensive energy, creating a barrier of light that pushed against the encroaching darkness. But something was different about this ghost. Her rage had been feeding on itself for months, growing stronger with each passing day, nourished by the salt of the sea and the bitterness of betrayal. The usual methods of spiritual containment seemed to wash away against her power like sandcastles before the tide. "Michelle?" Wei addressed the spirit directly, using the calm, authoritative voice that had soothed countless restless souls before. "Your pain is justified, but revenge will not bring you peace." He reached for his jade pendulum, hoping its generations of spiritual energy might help bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The ghost's laugh was like breaking waves on jagged rocks, hollow and dangerous. "Peace." The word froze in the air, crystallizing into tiny shards of ice that fell tinkling to the floor. He took my peace when he took my future. Now I'll take his. Her form began to stretch and distort, reaching toward Mrs. Wong with fingers that had grown long and sharp like coral branches. The pregnant woman whimpered, trying to back away, but finding herself unable to move, her feet anchored by seaweed that had mysteriously wrapped around her ankles. Wei felt the familiar surge of his gift rising within him, the ability to bridge the gap between the living and the dead, humming in his bones like a tuning fork, struck against fate. But as he reached out with his spiritual energy, he was unprepared for the depth of Michelle's anguish. It hit him like a physical blow, images flooding his mind with the crystal clarity of drowning memories. The joy in Michelle's heart when she first discovered her pregnancy. Her hand pressed against her belly in the locker room mirror, imagining the future. Mr. Wong's cruel dismissal in his office, his words cutting deeper than any knife. Get rid of it, or I'll get rid of you. The long walk along the beach as she contemplated her future, each step taking her closer to her final decision. The strange peace she felt as she waded into the waters, believing they would embrace her more lovingly than the father of her unborn child had. The weight of these memories nearly brought Wei to his knees. Behind him, he heard Mr. Wong retch and realized the ghost was forcing him to relive these moments too, making him witness the full impact of his cruelty. Father! Jinho's voice cut through the chaos like a blade of pure light. The boy had moved from the doorway to stand beside Wei, his young face set with determination. To Wei's amazement and horror, his son could clearly see Michelle's ghost in all her tragic detail. The spirit turned toward Jinho, momentarily distracted from her vengeance by the presence of one so young yet so attuned to her realm. You're in pain, Jinho said simply, with the direct clarity of youth. His voice carried neither judgment nor fear, only understanding. Your baby. It's still with you, isn't it? I can see it. The ghost's form flickered like an image on troubled water, and for a moment, Wei could see what his son saw, not just the vengeful spirit, but the phantom shape of an unborn child, still cradled within her ethereal form. The baby's spirit pulsed with a gentle light, untouched by the darkness that had consumed its mother. Michelle's hand moved to her belly, mirror imaging Mrs. Wong's protective gesture. For a brief moment, the two mothers, one living, one dead, shared a look of perfect understanding. Mei Lin stepped forward, her protective circle of crystals moving with her. The stones now pulsed with a gentler light, resonating with the baby's innocent spirit, rather than the mother's rage. Your child's spirit is trapped with you, Michelle, she said softly, her words carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. As long as you hold on to your anger, neither of you can move on. You're binding your baby to this world with chains of vengeance. The truth of these words seemed to reach something deep within the ghost, something that the ocean's cold embrace hadn't quite managed to extinguish. The water dripping from her form began to taste of tears rather than seawater, each drop carrying the salt of sorrow rather than rage. In the dim light, her ethereal form wavered, momentarily showing the young woman. She had been hopeful, loving, betrayed. I just wanted to be loved, she whispered, her voice now more human than supernatural, carrying echoes of the athlete she had once been, the mother she had hoped to become. The seaweed wrapped around Mrs. Wong's ankles began to loosen, dissolving into mist. The room held its breath. Even the city beyond the windows seemed to fall silent, as if Hong Kong itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Wei saw his opportunity in this moment of vulnerability, this crack in the shell of Michelle's rage. Drawing upon 3 decades of experience, he carefully wove his words with threads of both truth and compassion. Your child is loved, he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. The jade pendulum in his hand began to swing in a perfect circle, creating a small zone of calm in the supernatural storm. Not by the man who betrayed you, but by the endless cycle of spirit